got 3 more presentations for today. The first is a presentation by Trudy Green, who is going to talk about the research that she conducted for her Masters of Research, and the title is Age Differences in Peritraumatic and Posttraumatic Processing Using a Trauma Film Paradigm. And so Trudy, this is also her first conference presentation as well. So we heard from Braden earlier today. He did a fantastic job. I'm sure Trudy will as well. So welcome, Trudy.
Thank you, Viv, for that introduction. As Viv said, I'm going to talk to you about my master's research study, which was looking at the age differences in peritraumatic and post-traumatic processing using a trauma film paradigm. And this study was conducted under the supervision of Viv and Carly. Okay, so we were interested in the experiences of older adults during and after trauma. Okay, so we know that older adults respond better after trauma than younger adults. They have less psychological distress and fewer PTSD symptoms. And they also have lower rates of PTSD, both during their lifetime and over a 12-month given period. And yet, they have more traumatic experiences during their lifetime. So this is really intriguing. So older adults have lower rates of post-traumatic stress disorder, and we find this consistently in the literature, and yet they have more exposure to trauma. So we were interested in why this might be. So what we want to know is, do older adults have a different experience during the trauma itself, or is there something different about the way they process a trauma afterwards? So if we look at the diagram, we can see that pre-trauma, they're going about their normal lives, and then a traumatic event happens. During the event, they experience peritraumatic responses, which high levels of distress, high levels of physiological arousal. But we don't know if older adults are experiencing these responses to the same extent as younger adults are. Maybe they're having some cognitive decline, or they're not paying attention, or maybe they're not getting the same levels of physiological arousal as the younger adults are. Now, after the event, they experience post-traumatic responses. So these consist of intrusive memories, hyperarousal, avoidance of trauma-related stimuli, and negative thoughts and beliefs. Now, these responses are common after a trauma, but they normally subside over time. If they do persist, which they unfortunately do for a significant minority, then that's when PTSD develops. Now, it is possible that older adults cope with these symptoms better than younger adults. Or maybe they just forget the trauma and they just don't experience the symptoms to the same level. So to understand why older adults experience less PTSD, we need to understand what is going on both during the event and after the event itself. So one possible mechanism is that older adults use cognitive strategies more effectively than younger adults to manage their responses to trauma. And we know that several emotional regulation strategies are involved in the development and maintenance of PTSD. And there is some evidence that older adults are particularly good at using emotion regulation strategies to maintain well-being. So we were interested in 2 emotion regulation strategies, rumination and positive reappraisal. Now, rumination is a dysfunctional strategy, and this is where people think over and over about the event in a negative way. Rumination has been strongly associated with PTSD symptoms from various studies, using meta-analytical studies and using a trauma film paradigm. And we also know that older adults tend to ruminate less than younger adults. But what we don't know is whether older adults ruminate less than younger adults in response to trauma. In contrast, positive reappraisal is an adaptive strategy. And this involves looking at the positives in a situation, or looking at a situation in a more positive light. And there is some research that shows that positive reappraisal is associated with reduced distress and PTSD symptoms. And also in studies using a trauma film paradigm, training in positive reappraisal has also been found to reduce post-traumatic symptoms. Now, older people often use positive reappraisal, and it's been particularly beneficial for them for coping with adverse life events. But what we don't know is we don't know whether older adults are using it more than younger people, and we don't know if they'll use that in response to a traumatic event. So we know from the epidemiology studies that we have lower rates of PTSD in older adults. And it's really useful to consider this in the context of the models of general emotional processing in older adults. And the leading model in the field, which is SAVI, this suggests that older adults are particularly good at avoiding paying attention to stressful situations to minimize their distress. But this model also tells us that when older adults can't avoid paying attention to the stressful situation, they become distressed and they have difficulty in calming down. And what happens in that situation is they may become equally distressed as younger adults, if not more so. Now, this is really interesting in the context of trauma, as this suggests that if older adults are not paying attention, they're not likely to get distressed. And if they don't get distressed, then that could explain why they get lower PTSD symptoms. On the other hand, if they are paying attention, then they may get equally distressed as younger adults. And then this suggests that there's something about the way that they cope afterwards that helps explain their lower PTSD symptoms. So the aims of our study were to try and answer these questions. So when exposed to a traumatic situation, are older and younger adults traumatized the same amount? And does the effect of the trauma last in the same way? So 1 week after the trauma, are there any age differences in traumatic symptoms? And if there are any age differences in traumatization or lasting effects of the trauma, is this explained by differential uses of strategies to manage distress? So for our participants, we had 45 older adults aged 66 to 88 and 45 younger adults aged 18 to 40. We did some pre-screening and we excluded anyone who had pre-existing PTSD symptoms or cognitive decline. Now, eligible participants were tested using a trauma film paradigm. Now, this is a prospective design that reliably elicits responses that are analogous to symptoms typically experienced during and after a traumatic event. And this involved watching a film of traumatic events that included car accidents, drowning, and terrorist attack. Now, while this paradigm has been used extensively with younger adults, it hasn't actually been used with older adults before this study. So this is a diagram of the trauma film paradigm used in this study. So baseline measures were taken pre-trauma, and then the participants watched the film. Peritraumatic responses, which consist of physiological and emotional responses, were taken both during and immediately after the film. During the week following the film, an intrusion diary was used to capture their intrusive memories and details about those. And then follow-up measures were taken 7 days after watching the film. We used a variety of measures at each stage to capture baseline, peritraumatic, and post-traumatic responses, as well as the use of emotion regulation strategies of rumination and positive reappraisal. So our older and younger adults were very similar on the baseline and demographic information. There were no significant differences on anxiety, depression, and emotion regulation strategies. And the only differences we found at baseline were that older adults were significantly older, they had a higher education level, and more exposure to traumatic events. Now I'm going to talk about how people were traumatized during the film. Now, because the SAVI model told us that older adults tend not to pay attention, we actually used an eye tracker to check if they were paying attention. And what we found was that older adults actually paid as much attention to the film as the younger adults did. So the older adults weren't avoiding, and they actually had the same amount of distress, or they reported the same amount of distress as the younger adults. And this is really interesting, because this is what was predicted by the SAVI model, that when older adults don't avoid paying attention, that they would become similarly distressed as younger adults. And we measured physiological arousal using galvanic skin response. And we found that both groups were similarly aroused, although they were similarly aroused, but the increase was lower in older adults. And actually, this is quite common. We know that this dampening of arousal occurs in older adults, but they still became distressed. So overall, there were no differences between older and younger adults in how traumatized they were during the film. So looking at the post-traumatic symptoms, we measured each cluster of PTSD symptoms 7 days after viewing the film. Now, older adults had significantly fewer symptoms in all 4 clusters, which is intrusions, hyperarousal, avoidance, and negative thoughts and beliefs. Now, as both groups were equally traumatized, this tells us that the effects of the trauma actually don't last in the same way. And when we look at the effect of emotion regulation strategies, we found that older adults ruminated less than younger adults. And using a hierarchical regression of age and rumination with each PTSD symptom cluster, we found that when we added rumination into the model, the age was no longer a significant predictor of intrusion symptoms and hyperarousal. So rumination uniquely predicted intrusion symptoms and hyperarousal. However, for avoidance and negative thoughts and beliefs, age remained a significant predictor in that model. So rumination didn't uniquely predict those 2 clusters of symptoms. Now, with positive reappraisal, we found no age differences in its use, and it didn't predict any PTSD symptom clusters. And there were also no interactions between age and rumination or positive reappraisal. How do we go back? Okay, so what this tells us is that older adults cope with the aftermath of trauma better than younger adults. And one of the reasons for this is that they use less rumination. So what is interesting about this is that it is because older adults think less negatively about the trauma than younger adults, and not that they think about it more positively. Another important finding is that groups had a similar number of intrusive memories, but older adults reported less distress associated with their intrusive memories. And this is really interesting because both groups were equally traumatized, and the number of intrusive memories is consistent with this. But despite this, older adults had reported lower levels of distress. So this again points to better coping with their intrusive memories by older adults. So to summarize, there were lower levels of post-traumatic symptoms and distress in older adults. And we know that this was not due to age differences in peritraumatic processes, as both groups were equally traumatized during the film. The mechanisms involved were that older adults had a lower use of rumination, but not an increased use of positive reappraisal. And so older adults cope better because they thought less negatively about the trauma. Now, these results provide support for theories of aging, and it shows that there are vulnerabilities during the film and strengths in coping with the aftermath of the trauma. And what we also showed in this study was that the trauma film paradigm is an effective experimental method for investigating trauma processing in older adults. Thank you.
Older adults ruminate less, and does that relate to any theories of aging?
Ooh, good one. Yeah. That's an interesting one, and that's something that I actually found different to answer in my thesis. There was some research showing that they access autobiographical memories less, and I'm not sure, and they think about autobiographical memories less negatively. So there was some research around that, but very, very little research on why they ruminate less. So it's a very good question.
Just to follow on from that then, what would you do after this? What would you do with this information about rumination?
Okay, so for my PhD, I would then be looking at, we found that rumination, they ruminated less, but there are also many other, well, not many other, but several other emotion regulation strategies that are also involved in the development and maintenance of PTSD. So the first step would be to do this again so we can replicate the findings, but also investigate some of those other strategies. And then also we'd look at taking this into a real life situation and look at how our older adults compared to younger adults have used these different strategies after a real life event. So those would be the next steps.